I still remember the way the screen door snapped shut behind him. It didn't slam, not exactly. It had that slow, reluctant creak that gave you a second to change your mind before it latched for good. He didn't look back. Just walked across the porch, down the 3 steps I'd swept that morning, and into his truck like he was leaving a grocery store, not his mother's house. The last thing he said to me, what he turned and muttered before he shut the truck door, was, "You didn't raise me right." I didn't say anything back. Not because I couldn't, but because something in me went quiet, like a door closing inside my chest. He drove off, and I stood at the window and watched the dust settle behind his tires. That was the last time I saw my son. My name is Maggie. I'm 74 years old, and I live alone in the same house I bought with my husband in 1973. He's long gone. My son, too, in his own way. I've always been quiet, never one to stir the pot. I kept my pain neat and folded, tucked away behind smiles and casseroles and birthday cards, sent right on time. But now I'm going to tell the truth. Not to shame anyone, and not to get even. Just to stop pretending. Because when a man tells his mother she failed him, he better be ready for the story she's been carrying. The hardest years of my life began in a kitchen that never stayed warm. It was the winter of 1980 when David's father left. I remember it not just because of the silence he left behind, but because the heater broke the same week and I couldn't afford to fix it. I used to wrap David up in 2 layers before bed, then sit at the table in my coat, clutching a mug of tea like it could hold me together. That kitchen taught me a lot. It taught me how to stretch a pound of ground beef into 3 nights of dinner. It taught me the sound of my own hunger when I gave him my portion without hesitation. And it taught me how to swallow loneliness so deep that not even a child could hear it echo. David was 8 when his father disappeared. There was no note, no warning. Just a Friday afternoon where he said he needed a break, and a Monday morning where the bank called about a second mortgage I didn't sign. I remember sitting on the floor by the phone, the receiver still warm in my hand, wondering how I was going to pay for heat, for groceries, for David's school trip. I ended up pawning my wedding ring to keep the lights on through that first winter. I never told David that. I never told him about the time I sold my sewing machine to cover his dental work, or the night I walked 4 miles in the snow because the car wouldn't start and I didn't have anyone to call. He only knew that there was dinner, that his clothes were clean, that his lunchbox was full. He didn't see the cracks. I never let him. People always say it takes a village. I didn't have one. My own parents were long gone, and friends drifted once they realized I had nothing left to give. I worked at the diner during the day and took in sewing at night. Sometimes I was too tired to stand, but I stood anyway, because there was no choice. I didn't think of myself as strong back then. I thought of myself as a woman with a child who needed her. And when you love someone that way, you don't measure the cost until much later. I used to keep a little notebook in the kitchen drawer. I wrote down every dollar, every coupon, every shift I could pick up. I'd tear pages out when they got too full of red ink, as if pretending the debt wasn't there would make it easier to breathe. But I always wrote down David's milestones. His first spelling bee win, the time he got a gold star in math, the note his teacher sent saying he was a joy in class. I'd read those when the walls felt too close. Maybe I didn't raise him with ease or grace, but I raised him in a house where the lights stayed on because I willed them to. In that cold kitchen, I taught him what survival looked like. I just never thought one day he'd tell me that wasn't enough. He left on a Tuesday. It wasn't storming or snowing or anything cinematic like that. The sky was dull, overcast. The kind of gray that makes you feel like time itself has stopped trying. I had just come home from the grocery store, bags still in my hands, when I saw the suitcase by the door. At first I thought maybe he was going on a work trip. That's what he used to say those first few years when things were still holding together. But I knew, deep down, that this time was different. There was no business card on the counter, no scribbled note with a phone number, just a half-empty coffee cup and that suitcase, zipped shut like a secret. He didn't say goodbye to David, didn't even wait for him to get home from school. That was what broke me more than anything. I could have handled the betrayal, the debts, the months of quiet contempt he wore like cologne. But leaving his son without a word? That was something I couldn't forgive. I told David his father had to go away for a while. I said he needed time to figure some things out. At 8 years old, David just nodded. He didn't cry. He asked if his dad would send postcards. I told him maybe. I wanted to protect him from the truth, as if wrapping it in soft words could make it less sharp. But the truth doesn't dull. It just waits. The next few weeks were a blur of frozen dinners, overdue bills, and polite rejections from every job application I sent. I had worked part-time until then, just enough to keep us afloat. But with him gone, I had to find something full-time. The diner on Maple Street gave me the night shift. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep us fed. I'd drop David off at school, sleep for a few hours, then do it all again. I don't remember those months in detail, just the rhythm of survival. Wash, work, weep, repeat. I never heard from my husband again. Not a letter, not a call. He vanished in the way only cowards can, silently, selfishly. I found out later he'd drained our savings account the week before he left. I couldn't even be angry at first. There was no room for rage when every waking moment was filled with decisions about dinner, rent, and how to make 1 bar of soap last 2 more weeks. Anger came much later, when David started asking hard questions, and I had to pretend I still believed in men like his father. I held that silence like a gift I couldn't return. I used to think that kind of disappearance only happened to other people, the ones in newspapers or in sad books with faded covers. But no. Sometimes the man you married, the man who held your hand in the hospital delivery room, just stops being that person. And when that happens, you don't get closure. You get dust on a windowsill and a boy who watches the mailbox, like it might hold a miracle. And you, the one left behind, you just keep going, because someone has to. David was always a quiet child, not shy, not withdrawn, just thoughtful. He had this way of observing the world like it was a puzzle he was slowly learning to solve. When other boys kicked soccer balls and shouted across the schoolyard, David sat in the shade with a book or collected stones to show me later, describing the patterns he saw in their cracks. He was gentle in a way that made me want to protect that softness from anything that might harden it too soon. After his father left, that gentleness grew into something else, something heavier. He didn't ask why. Not at first. He just stopped looking out the window at night, stopped hoping for a car to pull into the driveway. He never complained, not once. But he began folding his clothes without being asked, cleaning his plate without a word. It was like he decided, without telling me, that he had to help me carry the weight. There was one winter, maybe a year after the disappearance, when David came down with the flu. I didn't have enough money for both his medicine and the electric bill. I remember standing in the pharmacy aisle, holding a bottle of cough syrup in one hand and a heating pad in the other, my fingers frozen from the walk there. I chose the medicine. That night, I piled every blanket we owned onto his bed and curled up on the floor beside him, just to make sure he didn't get worse. He never knew how close we were to freezing. He only knew that his mother stayed by his side, whispering stories about brave boys who survived storms. He was so proud the day he made the honor roll. He came home with that paper clutched in both hands, his smile stretching wider than I'd seen in months. We had no money for celebration, so I baked a cake from scratch with what we had left in the pantry. It was dry and uneven, but I lit a single candle and sang to him anyway. He laughed, a real belly laugh that filled the kitchen, and made me feel, for a moment, like everything might be okay. I kept that report card in my nightstand drawer for years. It reminded me that no matter how much we lacked, I was doing something right. But children grow. That's the cruel trick of parenting. You give them all the softness you can, and eventually, they decide what to do with it. I watched David shift as he got older. He started asking about college, about things we couldn't afford, and I tried to guide him without showing my panic. I told him he could go far, that I'd find a way. And I meant it. I always meant it. But I could see the resentment flicker sometimes when he noticed what other kids had that he didn't. He never voiced it then. He just held it like a seed in his chest, waiting for the right season to let it bloom. Looking back, I wonder if I sheltered him too well from the truth. Maybe I gave him the illusion of stability at the cost of honesty, but at the time it felt like love. Everything I did, every sacrifice, every silent cry in the bathroom while he slept, was rooted in that one belief, that if I made life soft enough for him, he wouldn't feel the sting I had. I never imagined he'd grow up and say it wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. The first time I met Jenna, she wore red lipstick and heels too tall for someone meeting her boyfriend's mother in a cramped apartment. David had just started his second year of college, and I'd scraped together what I could to help with books that semester. He brought her home for Thanksgiving. She barely touched the food and spent most of the evening checking her phone under the table. I tried not to judge. She was young, polished, probably nervous. But there was something else there, something cool and faintly dismissive in the way she looked around my place, like she was taking mental notes on everything that needed upgrading. Jenna didn't grow up like we did. Her family had vacation photos in matching outfits and a garage fridge just for sodas. She once told me she never had to share a room, never heard her parents argue about bills. I remember thinking how nice that must have been for her. But I also remember the first time she called our life quaint, with that tight little smile that people wear when they're trying to be polite and failing. She meant poor. She meant behind. David didn't notice. Or maybe he did, and he thought it was just part of growing up. As their relationship deepened, so did the space between David and me. He started coming home less, answering calls like they were chores, making excuses for holidays. Jenna didn't like the way I made decisions without asking for input, he said. She thought I was too set in my ways. Once, she told me I had an emotional austerity about me. I had to look that up. I laughed when I did, not because it was funny, but because it was the most polite way anyone had ever called me cold. And still, I tried. I tried to make her comfortable, asked about her work, complimented her dress, even when I didn't mean it. I bit my tongue more times than I can count. When they got married, I wore a dress from the clearance rack and smiled through the photos. Jenna's family took up 3 pews in the church. I sat alone. David didn't notice. At the reception, Jenna's mother made a toast about resilience and strong family foundations. I raised my glass quietly. No one asked me to speak. Afterward, Jenna pulled me aside and said, "Thank you for raising such a capable man." It sounded more like a closing statement than a compliment. I began to visit less, not because I was unwelcome, but because I knew my presence made everything stiff. I'd walk into a room and feel it tighten. There was always some new method of parenting, some article Jenna had read, some way I was doing something wrong. I used to bring casseroles. Then I brought books for Lily. Then I stopped bringing anything at all. One day I looked at David and saw a man trying to smooth over my edges for someone else's comfort. And I realized he wasn't reaching back anymore. He was holding her hand instead. It was subtle at first. A missed birthday call here, a text answered a day too late there. I chalked it up to life. They were busy. Young parents juggling jobs and Lily's school. But then came the forgotten Mother's Day, the voicemail I left that never got returned, the Christmas dinner I spent alone because they were traveling and forgot to tell me. I began keeping a calendar not to track visits, but to remind myself that the silence wasn't in my head, that I wasn't imagining the space growing wider between us. Jenna started speaking for both of them. "We've decided," she'd say, or "David and I talked and we think." I listened, nodded, told myself not to take it personally. But I did. Every time. I'd sit by the phone after one of those calls and stare at the wall, wondering what version of me they discussed behind closed doors. I imagined her saying I was too old-fashioned, too stubborn, too quiet. I imagined David agreeing, or worse, saying nothing. When Lily was born, I thought things might change. Holding her for the first time was like breathing new air. She had David's eyes, big and curious, and she gripped my finger like she knew me. I knit her a blanket, spent hours making it just right. When I gave it to them, Jenna thanked me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Later, I saw the blanket folded neatly on a shelf, untouched. They preferred something newer, hypoallergenic, certified organic. I began to feel like a museum piece. There for show when company came, dusted off for photos, then quietly returned to storage. I'd get invited to birthday parties with themes and catering, where everything had a schedule, and Jenna's friends talked about preschools with waiting lists. I brought homemade cookies once. No one touched them. There was a dessert table with labeled ingredients and gluten-free signs. David said nothing. He smiled at me, but his eyes didn't hold the warmth I remembered. Eventually, I stopped offering advice. When Lily got sick and I suggested a remedy my mother swore by, Jenna smiled and said, "We prefer to trust the pediatrician." I nodded. I always nodded. But inside, a part of me folded in on itself. I began to wonder if I was being erased softly, without malice, just forgotten by inches. And David let it happen. That was the part I struggled with the most. He once told me I gave him the tools to stand on his own, but what he really meant was that he no longer needed the hands that gave them. The cracks had been forming for years. I just hadn't realized I was standing in a house that no longer had room for me. It was a Sunday afternoon in early spring. I remember the dogwood tree outside my window had just begun to bloom, its petals delicate and pale, like the kind of hope that fools you into thinking things are softening. David called and asked if he could stop by alone, said he had something to talk about. I made coffee and set out a plate of shortbread cookies he used to love. I even put a clean tablecloth on the kitchen table, the one with tiny embroidered lemons that I had stitched myself years ago. I wanted him to feel welcome. I wanted something about the moment to feel normal. He arrived without his usual smile. No hug, no warmth, just a nod and the sound of his boots on my linoleum. We sat across from each other like strangers. He didn't take the coffee, didn't touch the cookies. I waited. He cleared his throat and began with something about space, how Jenna and he had been talking, how they needed firmer boundaries. I listened, unsure of where it was going. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers pressed tightly together. Then he said it. "You didn't raise me right." Just like that. Like he was commenting on the weather. He said I'd made him too independent, too hardened, that he was learning now how to express emotion, how to be vulnerable, how to raise Lily differently than he was raised. He said I was emotionally closed off, that I didn't create a home filled with softness and connection. He said he couldn't risk that same legacy for his daughter. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just sat there, feeling my heart rearrange itself around the words like they were furniture, too heavy to move. I thought of the nights I sat up sewing costumes for his school plays, the times I held his head when he was sick, the way I sang to him quietly when he couldn't sleep, even as I worried how I'd afford gas the next morning. I thought of every skipped meal, every scar I hid behind lipstick and sweaters, so he wouldn't feel the weight of what I carried. He looked at me, waiting for a response, maybe even expecting an apology. I gave him none. I told him I did the best I could with what I had. I told him survival doesn't leave much room for softness, but that it was never love I lacked. He shook his head like he'd already made up his mind, like this conversation was just a formality. Then he stood, thanked me for the coffee he didn't drink, and left. I didn't follow him. I stayed at the table long after the door shut, the untouched cookies staring back at me like a reminder of how far we had drifted. That was the last time he visited. The day my son decided that the woman who raised him was no longer someone he recognized. It was Lily who brought me back to myself, though she couldn't have known that at the time. She was only 9, all skinny limbs and wide eyes, the kind of child who speaks in honest bursts that catch you off guard. I hadn't seen her in almost a year. Jenna had quietly filtered me out with polite avoidance and perfectly timed scheduling conflicts. David followed suit. Birthdays came and went with no photos. Holidays passed without a call. I told myself to stop hoping, but hope, it turns out, has a long memory. She showed up on my porch one Saturday afternoon. I didn't hear her bike or the knock. I just opened the door to take out the trash, and there she was, sitting cross-legged on the top step, backpack at her feet, cheeks pink from the sun. I froze. She grinned and said, "Hi, Grandma," like no time had passed at all. I didn't ask how she got there. I didn't ask if her parents knew. I just stepped aside and let her in. She walked straight to the kitchen like she remembered where everything was. I made us lemonade. She chatted about school and friends and how she was learning the violin. I nodded, smiled, drank her stories in like a woman parched. It felt like being given a second chance I hadn't asked for but needed more than I realized. Then, as I rinsed our glasses in the sink, she asked it. So simple, so unguarded. "Why don't you come around anymore?" Her voice was light, but the question carried weight. I dried my hands slowly, turned, and met her eyes. I thought about lying, brushing it off, blaming schedules or distance. But something in me refused to bend anymore. I pulled out a chair and asked her to sit. We faced each other, sunlight catching in her hair. I didn't tell her everything. Not the betrayal, not the years of silence or the cold accusations. But I told her the truth in pieces she could carry. I told her how hard it was to raise her daddy alone. I told her about the nights I stayed up sewing and the mornings I skipped breakfast so he could eat. I told her I loved him more than anything, and I did everything I could to give him a life with dignity, even when I had none for myself. She didn't say much, just listened. Her little fingers twisted in her lap. Her brow furrowed like she was fitting things together. Then she whispered, "Daddy never said any of that." I nodded and said, "Abba." Sometimes people forget the parts of the story that made them. She came to my side and hugged me tight. And in that moment, I knew I had done something right. Even if David couldn't see it, his daughter could. That old bench beneath the oak tree had seen better days. The paint had long since chipped away, and one of the legs sat uneven on the ground, so it leaned slightly to the left. But it was where I used to sit when David was little, watching him dig in the dirt or ride his bike in clumsy circles. It was also where I went in the evenings, after he'd fallen asleep, staring out at the yard with a blanket around my shoulders and questions in my heart. I hadn't sat there in years, until that afternoon with Lily. After our lemonade, she asked if we could go outside. I said yes, and led her to the backyard, the grass patchy and the flower beds overgrown, but still holding on to the bones of something once beautiful. She walked slowly, taking it all in like a tourist in an old country. When she saw the bench, she smiled and sat first, patting the space beside her. I joined her, knees creaking, the wood groaning beneath our weight. A breeze moved through the leaves above us, and for a long moment we just sat in silence. Then she turned to me and asked, Was it hard being a mom? Her eyes were searching, not in judgment, but in curiosity. I looked at her and decided not to dress the answer up. I said it was the hardest thing I ever did. I told her I didn't always know if I was doing it right, but I always loved her daddy with every breath I had. I explained that sometimes love doesn't look like softness. Sometimes it looks like getting up when your body begs to stay down, or saying no when it would be easier to give in. She listened without fidgeting, which is rare in children. I told her how I used to pick dandelions with David in this very yard, how we made wishes and sent them into the sky like prayers. I said I wished for his happiness, for his future, for a life better than mine. I didn't wish for thanks. I never expected recognition, but I never thought he would rewrite the story either. Lily rested her head on my arm. She said she didn't know grown-ups could hurt too. I smiled and said, "We just get better at hiding it." She looked up at me, serious now, and asked, "Does Daddy know all this?" I said, "I used to think he did. But sometimes people forget things when they've spent too long convincing themselves of another truth." We sat until the shadows grew long and the air turned cool. Lily didn't say much more, but her hand found mine and held on tight. That small gesture carried more grace than any apology I'd never received. I didn't need to teach her anything in that moment. She was already learning that truth has weight, that silence is not always weakness, and that sometimes even a crooked old bench can be the place where healing begins. When Lily looked at me the next morning, there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't distrust or sadness. It was deeper, like she was seeing me not just as her grandmother, but as a whole person for the first time. We had breakfast together, oatmeal with too much brown sugar and a banana cut into neat slices. She asked if she could stay a bit longer. I told her she could stay as long as she wanted. I didn't ask if David or Jenna knew where she was. I figured the answers would come soon enough. She wandered the house that day like she was exploring a memory that didn't belong to her but felt familiar all the same. She found the photo album tucked into the drawer of the coffee table, the old one with yellowing pages and curling corners. She sat cross-legged on the carpet, flipping through pictures of David in overalls, David at Halloween, David holding a kite too big for his frame. I sat beside her and named the dates, the places, the stories behind each faded image. At one point, she pointed to a picture of David at about 10 years old, grinning proudly with a gap in his teeth. He was standing in front of a small science fair project made from cardboard and string. I had helped him with that one. Stayed up late learning how to explain simple machines so he could sound confident in front of the judges. He didn't win, but he had looked so proud. Lily asked why he never talks about when he was a kid. I said maybe it's too far back for him now, or maybe he just remembers it differently. She seemed to chew on that thought for a while. Later, as she packed up her things, she paused by the doorway. Her eyes, so much like David's when he was little, searched mine. "Will you tell me more next time?" she asked. I smiled and told her I would. Every story she wanted. She hugged me tight, arms small but sure, and climbed onto her bike with a promise to visit again soon. I watched her ride away, the sunlight catching her helmet, the wind tugging at the straps of her backpack. I stood there long after she turned the corner. My heart was heavy, but not in the same way it had been. It was heavy with truth, with the strange comfort of having been seen, not by the one who accused me, but by the one he was trying to raise. Some things can't be mended by confrontation. Some legacies shift only when the next generation dares to look closer. Lily was asking questions now, questions her father wasn't ready to answer, and I, for once, didn't need to explain or defend or beg to be understood. I had said what needed saying. The rest, I knew, would take care of itself. The call came 2 days later. I recognized Jenna's voice before she even said her name. Sharp, clipped, measured in that way people speak when they're trying to sound composed, but are really just barely holding back their anger. She didn't ask how I was or if Lily had arrived home safely. She went straight to the point. "Lily told us about your conversation," she said, like it was a charge being read out loud. I stayed quiet, letting her fill the silence. "You had no right to tell her those things. That was not your story to share." I could feel my pulse in my temples, but my voice was calm when I replied. I said Lily asked me why I didn't come around anymore. I told her the truth. Not the version colored by bitterness or blame, but the one I lived. Jenna sighed into the receiver, the kind of sigh that makes it clear the conversation has already been decided before it even began. She said I was undermining David's parenting, that children don't need to be burdened with the past. I didn't argue. I had no desire to pull her into a war of words she'd been preparing for years. What struck me most wasn't the anger in her voice. It was the silence on David's end. He didn't call. He didn't write. He let his wife speak for him again, just like he had during every small exile that came before. I wondered if he even wanted to know what I had told his daughter, or if he was simply grateful someone else was handling the discomfort for him. I hung up the phone after a few more sentences that felt more like instructions than conversation. But then the letters began, small, handwritten notes in crayon and colored pencil. The first one arrived 3 days later, folded in half, and slipped into a plain envelope with a single stamp. It said, "Thank you for telling me about Daddy's favorite books. I want to read them too." A week later, another. "Do you still have that blanket you made me? I wish I had taken it with me." And then, "Why don't people like talking about the hard things? I think it helps." Lily's questions came gently, without accusation, without blame. She was piecing together a version of her family that included me not just in stories, but in spirit. Her drawings were bright, her words unfiltered. She didn't need me to rewrite the past. She just wanted to understand where she came from. And in doing so, she gave me back something I hadn't realized I was missing, the sense that my voice still had value. I didn't respond right away. I let the letters collect in a small basket on my side table, rereading them when the house felt too quiet. They were soft echoes of a truth I had carried alone for too long. David might not have room for me in his carefully built life, but Lily had carved out her own space. One filled not with judgment, but with curiosity and compassion. And that was enough. I didn't need to knock on his door or fight for my place at their table. My granddaughter was doing that now in her own quiet way, asking the questions he never expected, holding up a mirror he didn't want to look into. And all I had to do was stand still and let the truth speak through her. The house had never felt more still, not lonely, not quite, but full of the kind of silence that settles when something has finally been said. I kept to my routines, the same ones I'd followed for years. Morning tea on the porch, watering the plants that refused to bloom, but also refused to die. I didn't expect to hear from David again, not really. The last words between us were already stretched thin, brittle with years of unspoken things. I had let go of hoping he would come around, but Lily came. She didn't arrive every weekend. Sometimes a week would pass, sometimes 2, but when she did come, it was without ceremony. No announcements or calls ahead. I'd look up from folding laundry or deadheading a rosebush, and there she'd be, standing by the gate, backpack slung over one shoulder, and her hair always a little wild from the wind. She came like a tide, gentle, steady, inevitable. We didn't always talk about the past. Sometimes we just sat on the porch with our hands around mugs of cocoa, or we made soup from whatever was in the cupboard. Once we baked a pie from scratch. The crust fell apart, and the filling was too sweet, but she declared it perfect and ate 2 slices. She brought school projects to show me, asked about old family recipes, and helped me label boxes in the attic filled with forgotten winter coats and photo albums. In her presence, the air in the house changed. It felt warmer somehow, less weighted. What surprised me most was how little she seemed to need from me beyond honesty. She didn't expect me to be her savior or storyteller or even a guide. She just wanted me to be there to answer when she asked, to sit still when she didn't. And that was something I could offer without apology. One afternoon, she asked if I missed her dad. I told her I missed the boy he used to be, the one who'd curl up beside me during thunderstorms, the one who cried when his goldfish died and asked if we could give it a funeral. She said she missed that version of him too, even though she never met him. I told her maybe she still could. People can change, even when they don't think they want to. The visits didn't fix everything. They didn't erase the ache or bring back the years I lost to silence. But they did something quieter and just as important. They reminded me that presence is a kind of protest, that staying put, standing in the truth of who you are and what you endured, can be a louder act than shouting. Lily was the one knocking on doors now. I was simply answering. It's strange what memory chooses to keep. Not the big moments, not always. Sometimes it's the click of a porch light being switched off, or the sound of bike tires crunching gravel. For me, it will be the way Lily looked back at me the last time she visited before school started again. She stood on the step, one foot turned like she wasn't quite ready to leave, and said, "I think you're brave." I laughed, told her I'd never thought of myself that way, but she just smiled and said, "That's how you seemed when you told me the truth." That stayed with me. Long after her bike disappeared down the street and the echo of her voice was gone, I sat in that moment. All my life I had seen bravery as something loud, marching into rooms, facing down storms, refusing to bend. But maybe it was also what I had done. All those years of getting up, choosing love, and surviving in silence. Maybe that was courage too. David never called. Not once. And while that used to sting like salt in a wound, now it just felt like a quiet fact, something unchangeable like the tilt of the earth. I didn't need to win him back. I didn't need to prove my worth to the version of him that only saw what he lacked. What I needed was already finding its way to me, in drawings taped to the fridge, in notes folded into envelopes, in the steady cadence of footsteps on my porch. I started writing again. Just small things. Recipes Lily asked for, stories about her father when he was young, little reflections on the days when the house was filled with noise and worry and purpose. I didn't write them for publication or posterity. I wrote them so that someday, when Lily was grown and maybe raising children of her own, she'd know where she came from. Not just in blood, but in spirit. Because family is not built solely on shared meals or traditions or names etched into photo frames. Sometimes it's forged in the spaces where truth finally breathes. And Lily, without meaning to, had carved open that space. She had asked and listened and understood. And in doing so, she became the bridge between what was and what could still be. I don't expect David to knock on my door again. If he does, I'll answer. If he doesn't, I'll still be here living my days quietly and fully. I am not the sum of his judgment. I am the woman who raised him through fire and silence. I am the grandmother who passed on more than recipes. And Lily, with her open eyes and stubborn heart, is the proof that some legacies find their way forward, no matter who tries to bury them. Autumn settled slowly that year. The trees outside my window turned the color of old copper, and the wind carried the smell of something ending. I began pulling out my heavier sweaters, folding away the thinner ones into cedar-lined drawers. And with each task came a sense of quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't shout with joy, but hums with something sturdier. Contentment, maybe. Or peace. The ache in my knees stayed the same, and the creak in the floorboards still warned of every step I took. but I noticed I no longer paused in the mornings, waiting for the phone to ring. Some wounds stop bleeding even when they never fully close. I understood that now. David hadn't reached out. Jenna stayed silent. Whatever storm my conversation with Lily had stirred in their household had either passed or settled into the corners where people keep the truths they'd rather not face. And I had stopped looking to them for resolution. There was nothing left to plead for, nothing left to defend. What remained were smaller things. The chair by the window where I watched the sky change, the worn wooden spoon with a crack down the handle that I still reached for without thinking. The letters from Lily, now tucked in a box lined with soft cloth, her drawings folded like treasures, and her visits, still coming when they could, still quiet and unannounced, but more assured. She moved through my home with familiarity now. Opened drawers without asking, hummed in the hallway, ran her fingers along the spines of books she'd already read. One Sunday afternoon she sat with me as I peeled apples for pie. Her hands were bigger than they used to be, more sure, and I noticed how she peeled without breaking the spiral, just like I'd taught her. She asked me if I thought people could change, even if they didn't know how to say sorry. I said I think change often starts in silence, in the small choices no one sees. She nodded, satisfied with that. She told me she had asked her father about some of the things we talked about. He got quiet, she said, and then told her he didn't remember it that way. She didn't argue. Just told him she believed both of us, but that some stories don't fit neatly into one version. I told her that was wise, and she grinned the way David used to when he got something just right. When she left that day, she paused at the door and said, "I think you gave me something important." I asked her what she meant. She said, "You gave me the full picture, even the hard parts. That's how I know it's real." After she was gone, I sat in the stillness and let her words settle. All my life I had carried my story alone, uncertain if it would ever be heard for what it truly was. And now, in the soft imprint of her footsteps, I knew it had been. Not by the one I raised, but by the one he was trying to raise. And somehow, that felt like enough.